Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Brownback talk, which will be on educating for the Anthropocene. We are glad to have Dr. Peter Sutoris here to lead this discussion. Dr. Peter Sutoris is an assistant professor at the University of York, UK. Peter is author of books Vision of Development and Educating for the Anthropocene, which would be the talk for today will be based on. He's also author of the documentary film The Undiscovered Country. He graduated from Dartmouth College and completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge. His research interests include anthropology of development, the role of education in development, scalability of development interventions, development ethics, critical and decolonial perspectives on modernity and progress, post-development, development communications, and environmental sustainability. We're excited to have you with us, Dr. Sutoris. I'll also introduce our discussant for today, Dr. Faith Mkwananzi, who's a senior researcher in higher education and at the Higher Education and Human Development Research Group here at the University of the Free State. Her research centers on higher education, mobility, and development in sub-Saharan Africa. She has interest in migration, creative research methods, collaborative stakeholder engagement, and operationalization of the capability approach. My name is Nyimbiri Suzyika, and I'm chairing the Brownback talk today. The talk will run as follows. We'll have 30 minutes for Dr. Sutoris to have his talk for today. And then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for the discussant to respond. And thereafter, we'll have time for questions and comments. For those of us who are joining online, you're free to type in comments and questions, and we'll refer back to them during the question and answer section. We'd also appreciate if your mics could be on mute. At this moment in time, I have the privilege to welcome Dr. Peter Sutoris to go ahead with the topic for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my slides so you can tell me if you can see them. Just 1 second. Is the sharing working?
We don't see the slides yet.
Okay, let me try again.
Yes, we can see the slides now.
Okay, excellent. Right. Okay. So yes, I'm going to speak today about my new book called "Educating for the Anthropocene: Schooling and Activism in the Face of Slow Violence," which was published by the MIT Press last year in November, and the book is open access. So you can access it from anywhere. If you just go on the MIT Press website, you can see there's a link for the open access version that you can click on, and it's all freely available. These are just some of the quotes that frame some of the chapters of the book, just to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the themes that the book is exploring. This is what the cover of it looks like. So I'm going to start by talking about the title and the word Anthropocene. I know that it's a title, it's a word that gets used in academia these days quite a lot, but it gets used in different ways. So I just want to explain how I'm using it in this book. What you're looking at in this slide is the sort of geological timescale. the geological eras of the Earth, going back millions and millions of years. Many of us would have learned in sort of science school classes that we live in the Holocene, that's the current era that we live in, which is the era that started at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the glaciers melted. But the idea of the Anthropocene is that the Holocene has now ended, and that we have entered this new geological era. And the name of the era comes from humans, anthropos, humans, Anthropocene, the human era. And the idea basically is that human beings have become the kind of dominant force that shapes the Earth, that shapes the natural environment of the planet. If you go back in time and you look at some of the other eras, and what happened when one era ended and another era began, often it was a very dramatic event. So, for instance, 66 million years ago, there was an asteroid that fell on Earth and caused, among other things, the extinction of the dinosaurs. So this transition between the Holocene and the Anthropocene is very significant. It means that we have become the asteroid, essentially. That's one way to look at it. Of course, I'm an anthropologist, I'm a social scientist, so I don't use this word in the way that geologists might use it. I borrow it as a kind of metaphor for the era that we live in and the kinds of issues that it raises and the responsibilities that we face. But I should also say that the word has its limitations and has been critiqued on many different grounds. I particularly like this quote, which says, "This explanation might be sufficient for polar bears or orangutans seeking to understand what species was disturbing their habitat." The idea that if you were a polar bear and you wanted to know, why is this happening? Why is my habitat being disturbed? And somebody told you, well, it's because of humans, then that might seem like a sufficient explanation. But if we want to go deeper, then it becomes very clear very quickly that this kind of lumping together of all humans into a single category really is not fair. We know that lots of people are more on the side of victims of environmental decay than on the side of perpetrators. We also know that different groups of people are affected very differently by environmental destruction. And so it's not really fair to be lumping everybody in the same category and sort of assuming that everybody is equally responsible and everybody is affected in the same way. There have been alternative notions that have been put forward, such as the Capitalocene, which places the responsibility with capitalism, the Anglocene, which focuses on the historical contributions of the English-speaking world to climate change and other forms of environmental decay. The Oliganthropocene, which looks at the role of oligarchs. There's any number of alternatives, and in the book I acknowledge these criticisms and I acknowledge these alternatives, and yet I still stick with the Anthropocene. And the reason for that is because, to my mind, when we think about the changing role of education and how education might have to respond to this historical moment, that's more of a future-oriented perspective. We're thinking about, anytime I think we think about education, we are thinking about the future. We are molding the future in a certain kind of way. And the Anthropocene, one thing that the word does is that it reminds us that all of us do live in the Anthropocene. All of us are affected in one way or another. So I think it is a kind of word that in some ways can actually bring us together in recognizing the shared condition that moving forward into the future we all face. Which is not to say that the history of how we got here is not important. It's crucially important, and I spend a great deal of time in the book looking at that. But nevertheless, I think in thinking about education, it helps us to think about identifying conditions that affect all of us in some way. because that can help us then think about how we might be able to change education systems to respond to this predicament. And hopefully it'll become clearer, why this might be important as I go through the rest of the talk. So let me tell you what the argument of the book is. I'm just going to, this is the only quote that I'm going to read out to you, which is from the introduction, and which is basically a summary of what the book is and what it argues. This book then is an ethnographic exploration of schooling and activism in relationship to slow violence in the context of intergenerational legacies of colonialism, racism, and environmental degradation. What is the relevance of such an exploration to the discussion of education's role in the Anthropocene? In this ethnography, we learn about the ways in which state-run schooling seeks to depoliticize the environment, co-opting environmental and sustainability education efforts in service of post-colonial and neoliberal agendas. These ethnographic accounts of schooling cast doubt on the idea that we can educate ourselves out of unsustainability, so long as education means state-sponsored social reproduction. They highlight a contradiction at the heart of global environmental and sustainability education policy. We are, as the British saying goes, putting the cat among the pigeons by trusting political regimes built on environmentally unsustainable ideologies to oversee and finance the effort to bring about sustainability through education. Such political systems have no real incentive to encourage young people to question the regime's fundamental values, such as infinite growth. This volume takes us into activist communities where such values are challenged, illustrating the ways learning for environmental justice and sustainability occurs outside formal education systems. So there's a lot going on here. Let me try to break it down. So the book is an ethnography, so it's an anthropologist's account of several different communities. It's a multi-sided ethnography. One research site was in South Africa, one was in India, and we'll get to that in a minute. It's talking about this idea of slow violence, which is also in the subtitle of the book. Slow violence is an idea that was put forward by the environmental humanities scholar Rob Nixon, who in his book entitled Slow Violence argued that much of environmental destruction happens very slowly. It unfolds at a very slow pace, almost imperceptibly. So it becomes very difficult for us to sort of in real time, be able to see the destruction unfold. It's very, very gradual. And that's in contrast to fast violence, fast violence of wars, of crime, the kinds of things that we see in news every day that we can capture, we can feel, we can viscerally perceive through our senses. And this makes environmental decay particularly difficult for educators. How do you educate somebody about something which is hard to perceive with our human senses? It becomes very sort of abstract. So he identified this problem, and in this book I talk about the idea of spaces of accelerated time, which is the idea that actually there are places that are perhaps a little bit ahead along the curve of environmental destruction. They are particularly strongly affected by environmental decay. And these are the places where slow violence turns into fast violence. So the environmental issues are no longer abstract. They're no longer just these frameworks that we talk about. They are they're everyday reality for people living in these places. And so the premise of this ethnography is that you can go into such spaces almost like stepping into a time machine, and sort of traveling into the future. Places like the place where I live, London in the UK, may not yet be affected in the same way that some of these places are, but it will be affected sooner or later. And so by studying how people are dealing with this with this condition, we can learn something that can help us make sense of the future and of this Anthropocene condition. So there are two places in particular that I looked at: Wentworth in South Africa and Pashulok in India. Wentworth is a township in South Durban, which is directly adjacent to the sort of industrial zone known as the South Durban South Durban industrial valley, which is basically where 10% or so of South Africa's GDP originates. It's the industrial zone that is directly attached to the port of Durban, which is the largest port in Africa, and which has a very particular history going back to the 19th century, where all of this trade and all of this shipping is taking place, and therefore all of these factories, and with the development of the fossil fuel industry, oil refineries are built in the vicinity of the port, and of course these are places that are very, very dangerous to work in, and so the white settler communities are not willing to put their health at risk by working in these industries. And so what ends up happening is groups of people are forcibly moved, resettled to basically come to the sort of vicinity of these factories, and to basically supply the labor to keep these industries going. But these people, people of color, are seen essentially as disposable. Their health doesn't matter for the government of the time. So there are actually historians who argue that you could trace apartheid back in time to South Durban, that this created a kind of blueprint for the kind of segregation of cities, segregation of residential zones, for these environmental reasons, that was then adopted, taken up later on in the 20th century as part of the apartheid regime. So this is basically a very long history of environmental racism that persists to this day, as we shall see shortly. Pashulok in India is a very different case. It's a rehabilitation site for people who were forcibly moved by the construction of a large dam, the Tehri Dam, which displaced about 100,000 people. This is in the northern state of Uttarakhand in India, in the foothills of the Himalayas. So you've got, unlike in Wentworth, where this is a long history, century-plus history of oppression and environmental racism and destruction, and the acceleration of the slow violence into fast violence. Pashulok is more of a sort of one-off big event, the flooding of a huge area that displaces a very large group of people, disrupts cultural connections between people and the land and their ways of life, and it's a sort of one-off act of violence which then has sort of persisting effects to the present day. So two very different cases, two very different sites. And let me just show you a little bit about what they look like. This is Tehri Dam in Uttarakhand after completion. Hugely controversial project, not just because it displaced so many people, but also because it is built on the river Ganges, which has a huge religious importance. So there was a lot of opposition to this project also from religious groups on religious grounds. And it's also built on a geological fault line, meaning that there is a high likelihood of earthquakes. And if there were to be a powerful earthquake taking place that led to the dam being breached, this could very, very quickly lead to tens of thousands of casualties downstream. So hugely controversial on many grounds, and was pushed through by the Indian government in spite of all of these objections. This is a street in Pashulok, which, at the moment looks like not the worst place to live, but actually when the resettled people were put here, I mean, they were literally trucked by the government, sort of dumped in the middle of a field without any infrastructure, completely sort of disconnected from their previous ways of life. And to this day, the Indian government has not lived up to many of its promises. This is a abandoned shopping complex where the school where I did my field work is currently squatting. So there is no school building. There is no sort of provision by the state. So a little bit like in Wentworth in South Africa, it's a case of sort of accelerating slow violence, but at the same time, exclusion, marginalization, oppression towards certain groups of the population, which oftentimes is what happens with these environmental issues, that they tend to affect the disadvantaged groups more than the privileged groups. Going back to the earlier discussion about the term Anthropocene and the kinds of hierarchies that maybe the term passes over or sort of neglects to highlight. This is a view from the school corridor in Wentworth, so you can see one of the several oil refineries in the area, in the South Urban Industrial Basin, is literally just a stone's throw away from the school, and the residential areas go all the way up to the very fence line of these factories. In the school where I worked, about 55% of students carry asthma pumps every day. They suffer from asthma, which when you go, on the other side of Durban, just 5 kilometers north, drops down to about 5%. So the kind of persisting effect of air pollution, but also other forms of industrial pollution, soil pollution, water pollution in the area are huge and have massive public health consequences. So you could argue that in some ways apartheid really has not ended in the sense that the sort of layers of environmental racism have not been unpicked, and they continue to affect the populations in this area. Right. So then the question is, how do you actually go about studying this idea of educating for the Anthropocene in places like these? How do you collect data? How do you get insights into how people are relating to this condition that can tell us something about the ways that the role of education might need to change? So in this research, I used a lot of visual methods borrowed from visual anthropology, because I was working mostly with young people, and it's quite difficult to sort of sit down with young people for an interview or for a focus group, and to and to be asking them these very, very difficult questions. So instead, what I opted for was these sort of visual explorations of their imaginations, both of the future and of the past of their communities. And in one of the exercises that we did, I asked them to draw pictures of what they thought the future might look like 100 years from now, and also what the past of their community looked like 100 years ago. And when you look at the drawings that came out of these workshops, there was a lot of despair about the future, like in this drawing that you can see, which is by a 12-year-old boy in Wentworth in South Africa, or in this one from India. You can really see that there's a clear sort of direction, in which these imaginations are thinking about the future. When it comes to the past, those images tended to be a lot more hopeful. They tended to contain a lot more natural elements, a certain kind of balance, a certain kind of harmony between the human and the non-human elements of the landscape. As you can see in this picture or in this one. So if this was sort of where I left it off, then I guess my conclusion would be that these children are essentially doing what a lot of anthropologists, at least in Western academia, do, namely despairing about the future and romanticizing the past. But the beauty of ethnography is that you do get to spend quite a lot of time in a place, and you get to go deeper. And the way I did that was by employing this method of participatory filmmaking, where I organized a series of filmmaking workshops with the children in the community, helping them master the sort of basic technical skill of video making. And after they felt confident in using the equipment, they would then take the equipment home. They would keep it for a couple of months, and they would make these observational films about their lives, about their communities, about their imaginations. It was a free kind of open space without any sort of direction or nudging from me. And what was very interesting that emerged, in these films that the children made, was that they tended to gravitate towards older people in the community, oftentimes activists. And this is another feature of these spaces, of what I call the spaces of accelerated time, that there tends to be a lot of activism. There tend to be these forces that are resisting what is happening in terms of the environmental destruction. And here we see a still from one of the films that was made in India, where the children took the opportunity through this sort of film exercise to get to know the elders in the community who were involved in fighting against the dam, and then later on also fighting for just compensation for the people who were displaced by the dam. And a similar thing happened in South Africa, where the children would go and talk to the activists fighting industrial pollution in the area. And here we see Desmond Desai, who is one of the sort of really prominent activists in South Durban, holding a device for measuring air quality, explaining to the children what the activists in the community are trying to do and how the children might be able to help. And so this kind of natural gravitation towards activism as a kind of alternative space of learning, alternative to schooling, alternative to these state institutions of learning, led me to this question of what activism actually can do, what it can offer as a form of education in these spaces of accelerated time, but also by extension, possibly to to the wider sort of world community in how we think about the concept of education and how it might need to change as a result of the Anthropocene condition. And so there are several important implications when we think about activism as a form of education. First of all, it forces us to decouple spaces of education from the spaces of schooling. We tend to equate education to schooling in a lot of the conversations, both in and out of academia, and that's not necessarily the case. This project and other projects that others have done around these issues have very much demonstrated that young people do learn sometimes much more from these informal spaces of learning and community exchange and dialogue than they might from the formal spaces of schooling. This way of thinking about education also forces us to recognize that perhaps the global direction of travel currently, when it comes to the way we think about curricula, the way we think about the content of what is being taught, may not be the right direction. We are currently moving in the direction of globalization of curricula, where curricula tend to converge. They tend to be very, very similar across countries. So when you look at the textbooks that are being used in Wentworth and the textbooks used in Pashulok, they are actually very similar. They contain this kind of generic content that is seen as universally relevant to every place. But activism is different. Activism tends to, at the grassroots level, certainly start from responding to local threats and local issues. The dam in Pashulok, the industrial pollution in Wentworth. These are the sort of triggers to reflection and to action. But you will not find anything about these in the textbooks that are being used in these communities. So again, it sort of raises the question of perhaps we need to think more about localization of curricula than globalization. And the implication of that also is that we have to give a lot of agency to teachers. We tend to think of teachers simply as deliverers of curricula, simply as these sort of not very creative or not very sort of agentic figures in the community who are simply given something that they have to then deliver, that they have to sort of pass on to the students. But the figure of the activist is quite different. The figure of the activist tends to evoke action, reflection, creativity, navigating the situation. And I think if we start thinking of teachers in a similar vein, that will really change our perception of that profession. Another sort of finding from this research was that in both communities there were actually quite powerful barriers between the activists and the educators. The activists tended to be very skeptical of the teachers in the community. They saw them as part of the sort of state apparatus that was spreading a certain kind of vision of the future that was incompatible with what the activists were trying to achieve. And vice versa, the educators also tended to be very skeptical of the activists. They tended to view them as sort of these extreme kind of figures who were oftentimes unhelpful because they were sort of getting in the way of life, really. So I think there's something to be said for thinking about how we can remove these barriers. How can we encourage sort of hybrid identities of activist educators and educational activists? And there is a section in the book called Outlier Teachers, which looks at sort of the teacher figures that I've encountered in both of these places in the course of doing this research, who were sort of really straddling both worlds. And such people do exist. And I think it would be interesting for us to think about, how can we make it easier for such crossing over between these two different camps, these two different identities. So what does educating for the Anthropocene mean then? If we think with the activists and we think through these alternative frames of education, well, it means that we first of all recognize the implications of the time that we live in, which forces us to think about deep time, which goes beyond these sort of individual lifespans of
Peter,
people.
just a reminder on the time. We have about 3 minutes or so before.
Yep. Yeah, I think I'll be able to wrap it up in a few minutes. Also, recognition of planetary boundaries and stewardship of the planet. And this idea of returning to a more quote unquote radical definition of sustainability. The way that people might have talked about sustainability back in the 70s, which was much more about environmental sustainability rather than the sustainability of the sort of global, neoliberal capitalist system, which is what I think the word sustainability oftentimes refers to these days. I just want to conclude by contrasting this idea of educating for the Anthropocene with 21st century learning, which is a sort of very dominant framework that you might have come across. You see there are these 21st century skills such as critical thinking, and on the face of it, it's hard to argue with these. I mean, they seem very sort of innocuous. But in the book, I talk about the ways that some of these agendas and some of these ideas might actually have become captured by different agendas and different interests. So, for example, the idea of critical thinking, has in many ways come to stand for what I call in the book problem solving for infinite growth. The idea that we are trying to produce graduates who have a certain kind of critical mindset that they can then deploy in addressing the challenges that their employers face in growing economically, but not necessarily thinking about stepping outside of this notion of kind of infinite economic growth on a finite planet, and being more critical of that entire framework. And so I talk about this idea of the 21st century model of learning kind of fueling infinite growth, which then leads also to the kind of violence that we see in communities like the ones that I looked at. And so in the book, I sort of argued that maybe we should move away from this model, and I try to propose a model which is more rooted in this idea of activists and educators, being sort of these hybrid identities. And I propose this model, which is very, very simple, and it sort of looks at, really what makes us human, grasping the thing which is at stake in the Anthropocene, in environmental decay, care as an emotional response to that which is at stake. And again, we tend to, in education, focus much more on the kind of cognitive, rational side of things than the emotional. So thinking about the emotional response of care, imagination of alternative futures, and the ability to communicate those imagined futures to others, which then leads to joint action. Once we were able to communicate those visions, we can act in unison. So this is a kind of activism inspired model of education that I propose in the book as a kind of alternative to this dominant idea of 21st century skills and 21st century learning. So yes, let me stop there, and thank you so much for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, for an insightful talk. At this moment, we will invite Dr. Mkwananzi to respond. Maybe you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm just going to use 5 minutes of those 10 minutes because it was a very interesting and fascinating presentation. Thank you, Peter. I think what makes it fascinating for me is that it brings together very important dimensions, which could actually be subjects of discussions on their own. For example, you speak about the idea of educating for the Anthropocene, and then you speak about activism, and then you speak about visual ethnography. And for me, those on their own are actually very interesting dimensions of your research. And I think I'll start by agreeing with the general idea that educating for the Anthropocene can be taken beyond the classroom or the school environment, as we have been seeing how it's been unfolding over the years. And I think schools are not the only spaces where we can actually learn about pressing environmental issues. And this idea resonates strongly with the work that I'm doing currently with out-of-school girls in Zimbabwe. So I think for those girls, even if there would be back-to-school initiatives that would support them to go back to school, they wouldn't want to go back to school for a number of reasons. But the question is, when we're discussing about environmental issues, should we then exclude those people that are out of school? So definitely taking these environmental concerns and discussions beyond the school classroom, I think it's a very good idea in terms of moving forward. And for example, where education would be more focused on the discovery and learning of the culture, the meanings that would come out of people's experiences in terms of engaging with the environment. That's something that doesn't come out strongly in the classroom setting. And also, I think another limitation of schooling, it really applies it has a formal application to intellect to solving problems. Yet people learn how to reason and apply logic practically outside the school environment with relative mastery of academic stuff. For example, if you think about farming, people who do farming, they don't necessarily need to learn about conserving the environment within very structured settings. I think their engagement, their experiences as they do what they're doing in farming, they can learn how to treat the environment in a different way. I think I certainly agree with the idea of activism as education. This draws largely on a recent project that we completed with my colleagues. We were working with student activists in terms of understanding what a sustainable university might look like. And I think because they all come from different environments, for example, gender, there are others who are advocating for equality in terms of access to higher education. All of them, some of them are political activists, but some of them actually support the cause, not necessarily in the forefront. And what I think we could draw from that experience is that there is a certain type of learning for them that's happening even as they conduct those activist activities on campus. Also, I think the targets, the people that they are working with, also learn a lot of things during that process, whether or not they're in the university. for long enough to see the outcomes of their work, I think it's something different. But the important thing is that they have set more like a conversation going for us to start thinking about how we can learn differently and educate ourselves differently in terms of the causes that they are pushing forward. And I think I'm very fascinated about the visual ethnography. It's something relatively new to me. It's very interesting, and I think I would love to read more about it. I got a sense of what it entails in your book, but I do have questions around that in terms of ethics, particularly because we work with young people, and also in terms of feasibility of using those methods and the sustainability of using those methods in communities that don't necessarily have the resources. For example, I did see that for people use cell phones, you need a smartphone, which might sound something basic to most of us, but in specific communities, some people don't actually have those kinds of resources. And another interesting thing that I want to highlight that I picked up from your presentation and reading your paper was we have worked with a community in northern part of Zimbabwe. So these are the Tonga people, and they were moved from where they lived by colonialists in the 1950s because they wanted to build a dam. So they were moved to a different part of the region. And their concern was that, so this community did a lot of farming, and then they did a lot of fishing, and part of the cultural heritage, what they do to preserve their cultural heritage, is to create scalps using trees, specific types of trees, and then they weave baskets using specific types of reeds. And I was thinking, as I was listening to you, in terms of what happens to those communities, even as we drive the agenda to be more sustainable and take care of the environment. These are people whose cultural heritage is actually linked to the environment. So if we now start thinking about, okay, let's do this in a different way, we need to preserve the environment in such a way, is that not a form of slow violence, right? Because we're trying to address slow violence for the environment, but now we're creating a form of slow violence for them that is maybe a potential extinction of their culture and their practices and their traditions. So where do we draw the balance in terms of realizing both without infringing on the other? And I think I saw something on your paper or book where you speak about environmental racism as well. And I'm thinking in relation to Zimbabwe, where we don't necessarily have environmental racism, but I think we do have an issue around ethnicity and the management of land and the environment based on ethnic groups. And how would we then address those injustices in such context, in terms of, in Zimbabwe, for example, activism is not tolerated. It doesn't matter at what level. We could be an educator, we could be an individual trying to advocate for change, but activism is not something that would be received by the government. So if we want to work together as different ethnic groups in such context, what could be the possibilities? Because I see how in South Africa there are specific ways and ideas in terms of addressing environmental racism, but that would be really applicable in all contexts. I guess another, obviously, because I research around higher education, do you think higher education institutions have a role in terms of addressing this environmental crisis? What kinds of graduates should we be thinking about producing who will act on or raise awareness of the current state of the environment? Should we actually be having those discussions in these university spaces, or should we be going back to schools and looking at that in the school setting? Another reflection that I had was on, do you think all of us are actually activists? And should we be environmental activists in different capacities? Because I do think that we as individuals certainly have the power to at least do something differently? And if we think we do, what kind of things should we be trying to do in addressing the environmental crisis? But overall, I really think it's a very interesting subject, interesting book, interesting paper, and thank you, Edward, for sharing the paper. I think certainly there are various intersections of the different justices, the causes for justice that we're all pursuing. For example, if you think about social justice, you think about environmental justice, you think about economic justice, they're all intersected. And I'm trying to think of a way in which we could actually address all those forms of injustices without infringing on the other. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. I think maybe Peter could respond to one or two things as people note down some questions that they might have for you as well.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you so much for that. Yeah, lots of food for thought there. Yeah, let me maybe start with the question about whether what is the role of higher education. I think higher education has a very critical role to play. I think maybe the role is slightly different from what a lot of the conversations that we've been having about this in academia have revolved around. I tend to almost think of it as a kind of de-schooling, to use Ivan Illich's term, that by the time the young person comes to university, they have been through a certain kind of education which might have actually disconnected them from those kinds of innate, to my mind, sort of innate capabilities that we have as humans, such as imagining an alternative future or care, as an emotional response to environmental decay. We tend to get desensitized and disconnected through education. So I think certainly some of the environmental studies programs that I'm aware of in various universities around the world, I think there's a growing recognition that by the time that these young people come to you in the university, in some ways it is too late. So what you have to do is you almost have to kind of undo some of the damage that was done in terms of trying to reconnect the person with the world and with themselves, not through these sort of neoliberal capitalist lenses that tend to sort of underpin a lot of education curricula, but through kind of a more humanistic approaches to education. And I suppose that also links to your other question about are we all activists, or should we all be activists? And my answer to that is yes, I think we should be. Of course, that word can mean different things to different people, and as you were also saying, in different communities, different cultural contexts, the implications and the trade-offs and the kind of balance that we have to find, it becomes a very crucial question. So I think we also have to think about contextually, what does it mean to be an activist, in a particular setting. But in general, I think it makes sense for us to subscribe to that as kind of part of our identities. Anyway, I mean, I could keep going, but I'm sure there might be other questions, so I want to make sure that we have time for those.
Oh yeah, sure. Yes, so we will have questions. We'll start with you.
Thanks, Suzyika. Thank you, Peter. My question is about, I hope I'm going to articulate it well, but it's got to do with like what you think is a threshold of education that's necessary as a foundation, so that when young people come into university spaces and we're doing this unlearning work, that there's an adequate, if you will, understanding or foundation for them to actually build on the knowledge that's gained within the system, so that the broadening of horizons, the transfer of values, kind of open-mindedness is actually possible. And I'm saying this also in the context of the project that Faith mentioned. We realize that the student activists we work with, who are based here at the university, conceptualized sustainability more in terms of Ubuntu, so drawing on the moral philosophy that's rooted in African thought. And so they were focused much more in their descriptions or understanding of sustainability on the economic and social dimensions, but not so much on the environmental. So when we think about education, or if we think about education also as being a transfer and exchange of values, what would you say is kind of like a minimum sort of threshold that needs to be there in terms of the values or education that somebody should have so that we can build on and or work towards unlearning some of these things. And if we then see that a person's understanding of sustainability perhaps leans more towards the social and economic dimensions, would that be a sufficient understanding of sustainability, or would the environmental one have to be there as well? So that's the one question, is about a threshold of like what needs to be there minimally for a person to kind of be able to take on these values that might be taught in the higher education system and outside of it. And then I was interested in it's a methodological question that's got to do with how you see the difference between participatory filmmaking and participatory video, which we've worked with. So I'm just curious whether you draw on the principles or some of the activities that are used in participatory video making, or if you see that as the same as the kind of participatory filmmaking that you talked about. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Maybe we can bring in Carmen as well. Someone, I think I've seen her hand there. Carmen, if you go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter, for a really interesting presentation. And I'm certainly looking forward to read the book, and the fact that it's open access is always great. So thank you for contributing to having open sources, you know, for everyone. My comment goes in relation to your alternative model. And of course, you know, I'm really aligned with your thinking, and I think the project is fascinating. But I was wondering at two levels, and I think these are just comments, you know, in case, you know, you found them helpful in thinking forward about that model, because I was thinking like, well, the model seems detached as much as the skill model from different values and cosmovisions. So how can you make this model multicultural, you know, and respecting diversity in a way? Because again, it seems like really aseptic terms, right? Communicate, grasp, care, and imagine, but imagine under which values and under which kind of actions, right? So I think I was wondering, like, probably a neoliberal person can come and say a similar model, but what they're gonna mean is totally different, right? I'm not sure if in the book you engage with that point, but yeah, it will be interesting to see how this articulation is somehow embedded in different values and local cosmovisions, and how it can articulate multicultural frameworks, right? Which I think with the foreign terms, you know, it wouldn't be sufficient. And then the other point is about whether you will be considering having another element as integrated, because I think, you know, like grasp, care, imagine, and communicate, it goes all, you know, in care you have some kind of relation between the inner and the outer, and I really love that you bring that into the point, because of course the importance of emotions and care. But what about, you know, integrating, you know, what we grasp as something important and valuable? Because I think what happened is, like many sustainability discourses, they end up floating, you know, like they are important, but there's not an integration of how impact our lives and whether we have reasons to value, you know. And I think many communities disengage because they are not capable of create this consciousness that is in a way an integration within the self, that I have reasons to do this kind of things to change the world. So I was just wondering if this is like a kind of social change theory in your way, right? A way of thinking, reimagining, and acting in the world to change it. And yeah, that's why the points of multiculturalism, values, and cosmovisions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes more before the meeting ends. So maybe quickly, Peter could share his thoughts over the two questions, or rather the two people that have shared comments and questions.
Sure. Yeah. No. Thanks for those. All very interesting questions. So just let me start with the first one around the sort of threshold or the kind of prerequisites that are necessary. Um, I think the answer to that question is going to depend on, again, sort of what do we mean by education? I mean, do we mean a lecture hall packed, with 200 students, where everybody kind of has to have a certain level of a prior knowledge or prior understanding, because you are not able to sort of individualize or customize the experience in any way? Or are we talking about a different way of education, where the individual and where the individual is at is perhaps recognized, and we're able to sort of meet them where they're at. And if you take the latter approach, then this question of sort of prerequisites and or the kind of requisite knowledge or understanding becomes much less relevant, right? Because when we are able to work directly with the individual, and we're able to sort of meet them where they're at, then irrespective of how much or how little knowledge or prior experience they have, we are able to make a difference. So I think it's sort of, that question kind of goes at the heart of the design of higher education sort of experiences. What is the learning experience within higher education like? So I'm sort of slightly dodging the question, but yeah, I think it's sort of, to me, it kind of leads us to reflect on that other question of what do we actually mean by higher education. The second question around participatory filmmaking, video making, yeah, I mean, these are all related. These are all related fields, and I sort of draw on all of that literature in the way that I sort of designed this methodology. I was particularly building on the work of David McDougall, who is an ethnographer, ethnographic filmmaker based at Australian National University, who's done this project called Childhood and Modernity, where he was looking at children's perceptions of modernity through film. So I kind of borrowed a lot of his thinking in the way that I designed this method, and also consulted with him quite extensively when I was designing this. So if you're interested to kind of learn more, then certainly David McDougall's work is quite interesting to look at and to read. Now, on the other the question about the kind of cultural embeddedness and the cosmologies and so on. Yeah, I mean, it's an important question, because in a way, whenever you propose any kind of model of education, it could be argued that you're basically proposing this kind of universalistic set of concepts, and that therefore there's something kind of inherently colonial about that, right? I mean, you could argue that the idea that education ought to have something in common in different cultures, in different places, in different countries, that actually is in itself a kind of colonial homogenizing notion that we need to get rid of. I think to me the question is, how do we find a balance between the kind of ideal, where we would have very kind of particularistic notions and approaches that are highly attuned to local cultures, versus the kind of pragmatic need for simply just the sheer number of children, of young people in the world. How do we make that viable? And so I think with this model, or with these concepts that I'm proposing, in some ways they really are not new. They're basically just another articulation of ideas that have floated around for hundreds of years, if not thousands, around education basically as a form of self-discovery, that sort of ancient Greek wisdom of know thyself, and through that know the world. These words, grasp, care, communicate, imagine, act, and they're sort of designed to kind of evoke a sense of reconnecting with our own humanity and the things that are kind of innate to us as human beings. So when a child is born, when a baby is born, one of the first sort of instincts is to grasp. The grasping is very sort of central to who we are as humans, as is care, as is communication, as is imagination, as is action. So the idea really is to kind of reconnect with who we are on that kind of a deeper level. And then, of course, when you're doing that within a kind of particular cultural context, right? I mean, the thing that you're going to grasp in one place is going to be different from the thing that you grasp in another place, and therefore the kind of external circumstances and the fuel that goes into this process, that kind of fuels that circle of learning, is going to be different, and therefore is going to result in different outcomes. So I guess that would be my answer, is that the model is kind of general enough, it's sort of zoomed out enough that when you apply it in different places, it will different things will be fed into it and different things will come out the other end. So I guess, again, slightly dodging the question there. And yeah, just very quickly on the last point about integration absolutely. I mean, anywhere between any of those points in the circle, so between grasping and care, but also between care and imagine, there are any number of kind of intermediary steps that you could identify, and integration would be one of them. So so by all means, I invite people to refine and critique and engage with the model, and if you want to propose new stages and new additions to it, I'd be delighted. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and we might not have a chance to thank you for a great talk. So at this point in time, obviously, maybe we could. Unfortunately, we could not have more questions. There was another question from patients here about survival and people making sure that they're environmentally friendly and all those is there. In case people had questions, maybe we could have a discussion after this. So thank you so much, Peter, and thank you everyone for taking part.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
All right. Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
So in case people had a few issues they wanted to